who I'm excited to tell you about. Oh, when you hit record, that's fabulous. So I'll just get right into it. My book is called This America of Ours, Bernard and Avis DeVoto and the Forgotten Fight to Save the Wild. I can see a couple of people there. If this is sort of like the crowd participation part, out of curiosity, how many of you have ever heard of Bernard DeVoto? By a show of hands. Okay, got a couple devotees out there. What about his wife, Avis DeVoto? Anybody heard of Avis DeVoto? Okay, well, there's a couple devotees. Hopefully, you will be doubly devoted after the end of this talk, which will take just about an hour. A quick pronunciation note. The DeVotos have one surviving son. His name is Mark DeVoto. He's 84 years old. He let me know that his dad pronounced his name not Bernard, but Bernard. So you will hear me say it like that. I am not proud to admit this, but despite having been born and raised about 90 minutes from this, I had no idea who the DeVotos were until I found a Bernard DeVoto book at the Strand bookstore in New York City, where I now live and work as a freelance journalist. This is the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. It is on top of the Bitterroot Mountains near the border of Idaho and Montana, my home state. It's in the middle of the Clearwater National Forest, which is part of America's incredible suite, hundreds of millions of acres of wild public lands that belong to us all. This book talk that I'm going to give you, it's a story, it's a love story. It's also a story about McCarthyism and the McCarthy era, but most of all, it's about public lands conservation. I'm going to tell you why the DeVotos are so honored on our public lands for the role that they played in the McCarthy era to help protect and defend our public lands. This grainy video from 1954 shows Bernard DeVoto pointing at what started his infatuation with public lands conservation. That is his maternal grandfather's farm at the base of the Wasatch Mountains near Ogden, Utah. That's the city where Bernard was born in 1897. The pointy-nosed little kid was so adorable that family lore has it that he won a beauty contest. Those days were numbered. This is his mother, Rhoda. She is born into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She falls away from it, becoming what I heard growing up colloquially referred to as a Jack Mormon. But it is her father, Samuel, who brings that branch of the DeVoto family tree to North America. Her father, Samuel, he immigrated from drizzly England to desert Utah in the 1850s when he converted to Mormonism, and he became a farmer, which was incredibly difficult. Sometimes in New York, people who know that I'm from the West will ask me, what is the deal with public lands? Why are there so many? Why are there different classifications? Are they all just scenery? Are they all just federal tyranny? And the simplest answer that I can give to that complex question is the same answer that Bernard DeVoto's grandfather figured out, which is the same answer that the ancestral Puebloans who lived and farmed in the American West 1,000 years ago figured out. The answer is water. Because unlike the humid eastern half of the United States, unlike rainy England, where enough precipitation comes from the sky in the form of rain to support family farms across vast expanses of the U.S. West, most of the precipitation catches as wintertime snowfall on the tops of high mountains. And the key to survival in the West is to get that snow melt, that water, down from the tops of those mountains into the valleys below, because that's where the towns and farms and cities and ranches are. And for that to happen, you have to have healthy forests and healthy grasslands. So at the turn of the 20th century, Theodore Roosevelt, our first great conservation president, he created around 150 national forests, mostly in the western U.S., to protect those water sources. And that made a profound impact on young Bernard DeVoto. because one of his chores was helping out on his grandfather's farm. Although Bernard DeVoto loved the West, loved its scenery, its history, its people, in 1915, he relocated to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he enrolled at Harvard University. When World War I came, he enlisted in the Army. You can see in this photo that his nose is now flat. He tried to play baseball as a boy, and he got his nose shattered by a bat. His days of winning beauty contests were behind him. But while he was not aesthetically blessed, while he was not athletically gifted, he was incredibly smart. And when he got to Harvard, he realized how smart he was. When he was in his early 20s, he wrote, quote, "My mind is as good as there is." So you can see that he was humble too. But while his mind was as good as could be, his heart wasn't. Not until in 1922, he met the love of his life, Helen Avis McVicker. Avis DeVoto was born in Houghton, Michigan. She grew up surrounded on three sides by Lake Superior. Avis was also incredibly smart. She also had a wonderful, vivacious personality. She was great at making friends. She had a really quick wit. Avis was also very fashionable, very stylish. And one thing to know about Avis DeVoto, she was absolutely fearless. She was completely daring. And she and Bernard were attracted to each other because they shared a love of books. But it wasn't just the ways that they were alike that made them work so well. It was also the ways that they were opposite but complementary. Avis loved to edit. Bernard loved to write. He dreamed of being a famous writer. Bernard loved attention. Avis cherished her privacy. Bernard loved to eat. Avis loved to cook. All her life, she was fascinated with food and with cooking. Remember that. This is the first photograph of the DeVotos together. This is them on their honeymoon in 1923. But Avis could never truly know her husband until she knew where he came from, the American West. So in 1925, they got on a train to Ogden, Utah, and Bernard introduced Avis to her father-in-law, Florian DeVoto. He had come west on the Transcontinental Railroad and stayed in Ogden to work as a land title specialist. While the DeVotos were in Ogden, Bernard wanted to show Avis what in his youth had been a paradise, the Wasatch National Forest. So they rented a little cabin in a high mountain valley. And when they got there, they were aghast at what they saw. Because in order to boost lumber production in World War I, logging regulations were lifted, but then never put back in place in peacetime. And in order to boost beef and wool production, grazing regulations were lifted and then never put back in place. And when the DeVotos were up in this denuded landscape, a rainstorm hit and a flash flood came at them, and it almost killed them. The DeVotos made out a lot better than many Westerners in the 1920s because flash floods devastated towns and cities all over the region. Pueblo, Colorado, Silver City, New Mexico, Escalante, Utah, always for the same reason, because of conservation failures. Been grazed almost to extinction was the postmortem. So while it was working on his grandpa's farm that gave Bernard DeVoto an appreciation for public lands, it was these deadly floods of the 1920s that made him realize the importance of protecting public lands. And that passion, which both DeVotos shared for the rest of their lives, that pitted them against the great nemesis of their lives, Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. If you've ever seen The Godfather Part 2, it opens up at Lake Tahoe with mobster Michael Corleone being shaken down for a bribe by corrupt Nevada Senator Pat Geary. That is the on-screen representation of real-life corrupt Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Early Nevada was so corrupt, it was known as the Rotten Borough, and Democratic Senator McCarran embodied that corruption. He cultivated a constituency that lived in mansions at Lake Tahoe and owned ginormous ranches out in the desert. And on behalf of that acquisitive constituency, McCarran went to war against a conservation agency that Franklin Roosevelt created to help fight the Dust Bowl. The Roaring Twenties in America were followed by the Dirty Thirties. And to protect the native grasses with the long, deep roots that held the soil in place, Franklin Roosevelt created an agency called the Grazing Service. It would do for grass what Theodore Roosevelt's U.S. Forest Service did for trees. It was to protect that natural resource. And Pat McCarran went to war against the Grazing Service in a very manipulative and duplicitous way. He announced he would hold a series of open public meetings all across the West where anybody could come and voice concerns about public lands. But secretly, McCarran stage managed these meetings to give the best speaking times and allow the topics that would be discussed to be dictated by only the people he wanted to hear from, which were the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest sheep barons. So while McCarran amplified their voices, he diminished and dismissed the voices of everybody else. And this was a plurality of Westerners. These were small ranchers, Native Americans, hunters, hikers, anglers, wildlife lovers, municipal water suppliers, irrigation farmers. It would have included the DeVotos, except in the 1930s, the DeVotos put down roots far away from the West. They settled in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the 1930s is the decade when the DeVoto literary star takes off. In 1935, Bernard DeVoto is given the honor of writing the monthly Easy Chair column for Harper's Magazine. It's the oldest continuous feature in American journalism. It's still going today. Writing this monthly column gave Bernard DeVoto a national platform for his increasingly pointed and sometimes controversial opinions on issues like public lands conservation. Harper's didn't pay very much money, so to subsidize his income, Bernard DeVoto wrote serialized fiction for big glossy magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. These were like the Netflix series of that era. And with stories going out and money coming in, the DeVotos began to live what appeared to be a very glitzy and glamorous lifestyle. They threw parties that were legendary. If you look at the side of this photo series, you can see Avis DeVoto's reaction to some of the shenanigans that went on at these parties. Their newfound fame brought literary luminaries into their lives. This is Bernard DeVoto with the poet Archibald MacLeish and the novelist Ralph Ellison. This is Avis DeVoto with the great poet Robert Frost. But while the DeVotos appeared to be living a very happy and successful life, that masked the fact that they were going through some pretty intense private turmoil. Part of that turmoil was because Robert Frost, pictured here, eating wild berries with Avis and appearing to admire her while Bernard holds the camera, he tried to come between the DeVotos. And at the same time, Bernard DeVoto started a relationship with this young woman, Catherine Stern. It was never a physical relationship. Catherine Stern was a writer for the New York Times in her mid-20s when she came down with tuberculosis. And she spent the rest of her relatively short life inside of an iron lung. And though she and Bernard DeVoto never met in person, from that iron lung, she wrote him a fan letter. And over the span of a decade, they swapped hundreds and hundreds of intimate letters. And Avis knew about this, and she was okay with it because Avis was all right with whatever Bernard DeVoto felt he had to do to regulate his mood, because Avis knew the personal hell that Bernard DeVoto was going through. Part of the reason Bernard was going through hell was he wanted to write the great American novel. He saw himself as a novelist, and he did write novels, and they were lousy. And they didn't sell very well, and they got mixed reviews, and he had to come to accept the fact that he didn't have a great novel in him. He was also the type of person just constitutionally, who was never really at home any place or in any crowd. When he was growing up in Utah, he was too fixated on what might be happening in intellectual capitals like Harvard to really fit in. When he was finally at Harvard, he was too obsessed with U.S. Western history to really fit in. And nowhere was Bernard DeVoto more of a maverick, more of an iconoclast, more of a total free thinker than politically. In the 1930s, the nation swung far to the left because of the stock market crash and the Great Depression. And during that decade, millions of Americans voted for socialist and even communist candidates for public office. And within the realm of academia and literature, more than a few voices said that the United States should maybe emulate relatively new Soviet Russia. And within his sphere, nobody more loudly and often rudely than Bernard DeVoto said that anybody who thought that was an idiot. DeVoto said that anybody who thought communism was viable, anybody who thought that Karl Marx was particularly smart, was suffering from a, quote, imbecile delusion, unquote. So in the 1930s, people called Bernard DeVoto a fascist. So it was that combination of things. It was that always putting intense pressure on himself, never really being at home with any crowd, and that absolute commitment to his own free thinking, no matter the social costs. That put a heavy psychic strain on Bernard DeVoto, and he went through some suicidal depressions. Fortunately, Avis provided the emotional stability and support to get him through. And come the 1940s, they had started a family. They had two boys, Gordon and Mark. And this is the decade when the DeVoto literary star reaches its heights. Bernard DeVoto will write a trilogy of Western historical nonfiction. This trilogy will cement his literary legacy. It will win major awards. Bernard DeVoto finds his true voice writing nonfiction about the West. And the first book in this awesome trilogy is called The Year of Decision, 1846. In cinematic prose, Bernard DeVoto writes about the grit of soldiers in the Mexican-American War and the plight of Mormons who flee to the deserts of what will become Utah looking for religious freedom. He writes about the Donner Party who get trapped atop the Sierra Nevada mountains in the winter and survive by cannibalism. This book came out at the low point of World War II, and it was seen as an allegory for what U.S. soldiers were going through fighting Imperial Japan and Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And because this book so inspired U.S. soldiers, it became a smash hit. DeVoto followed it up working farther back in Western history to the heyday of the Rocky Mountain fur trade. Across the wide Missouri, which wins the Pulitzer Prize, it tells the story of the Mountain Men. DeVoto's next book, The Course of Empire, which wins the National Book Award, it works even farther back in Western history. And because of that, it features two characters who Bernard DeVoto affectionately refers to as my boys, Lewis and Clark. Bernard DeVoto wrote so expertly and evocatively about the explorers Lewis and Clark that he would get fan mail like this from some Boy Scouts in Long Island. And you can see these scouts have made letterhead with elaborately drawn scenes from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and they've drawn a map of the Lewis and Clark Trail. And these Boy Scouts begged Bernard DeVoto, take us with you. Guide us along the Lewis and Clark Trail, because come the end of the war in 1946, that's exactly what Bernard DeVoto intended to do. He was going to take Avis and their boys on the research trip of a lifetime. They were going to drive from Massachusetts to the Pacific Ocean, following the Lewis and Clark Trail and visiting national parks and public lands all along the way. And Bernard DeVoto intended to write at least one column for Harper's Magazine about this adventure. And based on the work that he had been following in the West in the 1930s with the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, and the good work it was doing, he expected that this was going to be a hopeful column. And when the DeVotos went west for research, as they did a number of times, they really did it up. They wanted to talk to everybody that they could. They wanted to learn everything that they could. Bernard would go out hiking with officials in the U.S. Forest Service to learn the plants, the wildlife, the ecosystems. Avis would befriend National Park Service rangers. They would see the tourist sites. Here is Avis and her son Gordon at some geysers in Yellowstone National Park. This is Avis and Gordon riding on a chairlift to the top of a peak in the Colorado Rockies to get a panoramic vista. Bernard DeVoto was too afraid of heights to join them, but he would go flying around with smoke jumpers who took off from the little airport in my hometown, Missoula, Montana. They would get out on the water. Bernard would float down the Missouri River with the great Montana novelist Bud Guthrie Jr., like they were characters in a Mark Twain story. This is Avis in the middle of Jenny Lake in Grand Teton National Park, looking typically fashionable. But one thing that Bernard DeVoto would always do wherever he went is he would drop down on his hands and knees and he would check out the grass because he wanted to see if the ranges were being overgrazed. And the answer to that question after 1946 was yes, because of Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. With the world distracted by war, McCarran escalated those public land hearings that he was holding throughout the West, and they began to take on a sadistic twist. McCarran began to order employees of the Park Service and the Forest Service and the Grazing Service to attend his meetings, and he would forbid them to speak, and he would invite his hand-selected audience members to shout insults at them. A McCarran aide said the purpose of this was to affect these conservation professionals, quote, psychologically, unquote. And through the 1940s, McCarran began to assert that anybody who disagreed with him, anybody who dissented from his position, was disloyal to America. So as these public land hearings went on, McCarran went from just amplifying the voices of the people he wanted to hear from, the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest sheep barons, and diminishing and dismissing the voices of the people he didn't want to hear from. McCarran began to demonize the people he didn't want to hear from. He began to call them communists. And McCarran in the 1940s began to assert that the United States was becoming filled up with communists who were out to destroy America from within. And McCarran collected thousands of pages of testimony that was cooked before it was collected at these public land hearings. And he used it as justification to flex his muscle on Senate appropriations committees. And so Pat McCarran defunded the U.S. Grazing Service, this conservation agency that Franklin Roosevelt created to fight the Dust Bowl. Because Pat McCarran so slashed the budget of the U.S. Grazing Service, in 1946, the new president, Harry Truman, combined what was left of it with the moribund and historically corrupt General Land Office to create a new and enfeebled conservation agency, the Bureau of Land Management. This is the birth of the BLM. Well, the first BLM. It should have been called the Bureau of Pat McCarran. The environmental writer Edward Abbey would soon call the BLM the Bureau of Livestock and Mining, which is exactly what Pat McCarran wanted. The DeVotos go west in June 1946, the same month that the BLM is born, and they don't quite recognize the ramifications of what just happened. The DeVotos leave in their 6-year-old Buick sedan, stuffed with all the supplies that the family's going to need for 3 months, and when they first reached the U.S. West, they were having a great time. They were stopping at roadside historical markers and buying souvenirs and posing for family photos. But what the DeVotos saw turned tragic when they reached the Dakotas, and they saw the beginnings of the Garrison Dam. The Garrison Dam across the Missouri River was going to build a reservoir that would flood out some 150,000 acres of the homelands of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations, all without permission from those nations. This painful photograph shows the, quote, authorization, unquote, of the already under construction Garrison Dam. The gentleman weeping there is a representative of those tribal nations. When the DeVotos see scenes like this, they can't believe their eyes. They thought that scenes of mass native dispossession like this were something out of the 1800s, not the mid-1900s. And the DeVotos know from their deep study of U.S. history that the biggest public land frauds, the biggest public land scams, went hand in hand with this kind of native dispossession because the common denominator is greed. It's natural resource looting, natural resource plundering. The DeVotos can chart the entire history of Western settlement through a series of natural resource raids. First for fur, then gold, then grass, then timber, then oil, then water, then the land itself. The DeVotos know that if they're seeing scenes like this in Indian country, they need to have their eyes and ears open in case there's an even bigger raid on natural resources planned for other federally protected lands, some kind of plot that might go back to Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, pictured here on a reservoir catching a bass. Continuing on the Lewis and Clark Trail, the DeVotos get to the eastern Montana ranching community of Miles City, and they go to the Range Riders Cafe, because remember, Bernard DeVoto loves to eat, and he knows that the Range Riders Cafe serves the best steak in America. He will gleefully crow to his readers on the eastern seaboard that for no amount of money in their time zone could they get a steak anywhere near as good as the one he could get for $1.50 at the Range Riders. But while they're in there, they eavesdrop and they overhear a, quote, very loud and very drunk cattleman, unquote, give them a tip. The tip is that their hunch was correct. There was a big raid on natural resources on federal lands being cooked up, and it did lead back to Pat McCarran. And at this juncture, the DeVotos transformed into investigative journalists. And they decided that if they could somehow get the exact details of this plot that they overheard being talked about by cowboys at the Range Riders Cafe, they could put it into Harper's Magazine, they could expose it, maybe they could stop it from happening. And so their National Park Lewis and Clark adventure turned into a networking odyssey, and they went around the West meeting with sources, asking people if they knew anything about this plot. Their first stop was Great Falls, Montana. They met with the journalist Joseph Kinsey Howard, who is rightfully in the Montana Journalism Hall of Fame. He wrote one of the best books about the state, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome. In Yosemite National Park in California, they met with their mutual friend Ansel Adams, the great landscape photographer. They asked him what he knew. They met with their mutual friend Wallace Stegner, whose career as a novelist Bernard helped to launch by writing rave reviews of his work. But they got their big break in Bernard DeVoto's hometown of Ogden, Utah. They met with this gentleman, Chet Olson, a Forest Service official. All through the 1930s, Chet Olson led hundreds and hundreds of CCC workers up into the Wasatch Mountains, and they replanted trees and they replanted grass and they stopped those deadly floods. And Chet Olson knew something. He knew that in August 1946 in Salt Lake City, there was going to be a meeting of some of the West's biggest cattle ranchers and biggest sheep barons. And at that meeting, a small group was going to meet in private, and they were going to hash out a legislative agenda. And that legislative agenda would have all the details that the DeVotos had been searching for, from the Dakotas through Montana and Idaho and Washington and Oregon and California and Nevada and Utah and Wyoming and Colorado. Everything was going to be revealed at that meeting, which, of course, Nevada Senator Pat McCarran was presiding over. Somehow, that Forest Service official got a copy of that secret transcript into Bernard DeVoto's hands, and what he read set his stubby hair on fire. The plan was this: to take every acre under the new and enfeebled Bureau of Land Management, around 150 million, transfer them to states and sell them off to the highest bidder, and then have Pat McCarran-approved survey crews go into national forests, national monuments, and national parks and transfer out possibly 80 million more acres. All told, the number of acres at stake was around 230 million, which is roughly equivalent to everything that Theodore Roosevelt protected. This calico-looking map that Westerners know shows kind of what was at stake. The yellow is BLM land, the light green is Forest Service land, the salmon color is Indian country, the dark green is National Park Service land. DeVoto wrote, Senator McCarran has been the ablest representative of cattle and sheep interests in Washington against the West and the people of the United States. And he put that in the January 1947 issue of Harper's Magazine in an explosive expose that he titled The West Against Itself. That headline being a reference to politicians like McCarran who, for quick cash and political gain, would liquidate the natural resources of the West, which is to say, the future of the West and of America. And DeVoto spelled out in simple language this complicated plot. He wrote, the plan is to get rid of public lands altogether, turning them over to the states, which can be coerced as the federal government cannot be, and eventually to private ownership. This is your land we are talking about. DeVoto wrote that, incidentally, just a few years after Woody Guthrie wrote This Land Is Your Land, but before that song became a classic. That article, The West Against Itself, it did everything that the DeVotos hoped that it would. Bernard DeVoto remembered that it, quote, fused an explosion, unquote. It rendered that land grab suite of legislation too radioactive for any politician to touch, even Pat McCarran. The DeVotos in the 1940s saved as many as 230 million acres of public lands from being sold off. But as the 1940s turned into the 1950s, a very powerful new ally came to the aid of Senator Pat McCarran, or rather, somebody who had been a nobody in Congress transformed himself into the most prominent member of Congress by mimicking Pat McCarran, like a character actor stepping into a role. You'll notice that when Pat McCarran gets fan mail, it comes with stickers on it that say, I'm for McCarthy, that being a reference to the Wisconsin senator and demagogue Joe McCarthy. And Pat McCarran would get fan mail on incredible letterhead like this, with heroically drawn pictures of Joe McCarthy and the sayings, McCarthyism is Americanism, and I like McCarthy and his methods. Well, where did Joe McCarthy get those methods of smearing innocent Americans as communists? From Nevada Senator Pat McCarran. Remember, it was Pat McCarran during those public land hearings in the 1940s who began to claim that America was becoming filled up with communists, people who were disloyal and out to destroy America from within, and that he, Pat McCarran, was going to stop them. That's what Joe McCarthy started to say in 1950, only when McCarthy said it, it went that era's version of viral. And McCarran and McCarthy became a duo because each one had something that the other did not. Joe McCarthy had a genius for publicity and attracting attention. This is why today we talk about McCarthyism and the McCarthy era rather than what we should talk about, which is McCarranism and the McCarran era. But Pat McCarran had a genius for legislating. So the actual laws that codified McCarthyism, they were all passed by Pat McCarran. And these were some of the most oppressive laws in the history of the United States. Pat McCarran, for a time, legalized concentration camps in America. The key to understanding McCarthyism is to understand Pat McCarran. If you wanted to know what was going to come out of the mouth of young Republican Joe McCarthy, you needed to only look at what just came out of the mouth of old Democrat Pat McCarran. And Joe McCarthy's innovation was rhetorical. It was a manner of speaking. It was the art of the smear. It was a way of making innocent people seem guilty, sound guilty through inference and allusion and innuendo and association. It was a way of achieving a dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. And that McCarthyist way of speaking started to get picked up on by Pat McCarran's allies in the West, including a gentleman named J. Elmer Brock, who was once the president of the powerful Wyoming Stock Growers Association. After Bernard DeVoto exposed and thwarted the land grab, J. Elmer Brock decided to inform on him to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. Brock did it on his livestock company's stationery. Brock told Hoover, quote, "As far as the sentiments of the stockmen in the West, we would like to see Bernard hanging from a cottonwood limb." This is in Bernard DeVoto's FBI file. Maybe there's nothing really wrong with that. Maybe that's just a guy blowing off some steam, except that J. Elmer Brock included in that parcel to J. Edgar Hoover an article that the Wyoming stock growers had published in their own magazine. And that article asked whether America might be better if Bernard DeVoto moved to Russia, or whether DeVoto ought to, quote, "have a hammer and sickle over his desk," unquote. This is also in Bernard DeVoto's FBI file, and you can see that the hammer and sickle line is underlined, and there's a big arrow pointed to it. Now, if the Wyoming stock growers had written, quote, "DeVoto is a communist," unquote, DeVoto could sue them for libel. But if they just ask whether he ought to move to Russia or maybe have a hammer and sickle over his desk, they achieve that dramatic effect while eliding responsibility. That's McCarthyism. And that became of grave concern to Bernard DeVoto, this McCarthyist way of speaking, and the fact that the FBI was now collecting that type of information. It was a threat, Bernard DeVoto thought. Bernard DeVoto pictured here at his desk with neither a hammer nor a sickle over it. It was a threat to the Bill of Rights, he thought, because it jeopardized Americans' right to due process. And so in 1949, Bernard DeVoto was inspired to write the most controversial column of his career, "Due Notice to the FBI." This is one of the first pieces in a national magazine to criticize Joe McCarthy, but more so, it takes the FBI to task for collecting McCarthyist gossip and innuendo and slander and backbiting. Around the time that this article came out, a Gallup poll showed that 78% of Americans thought that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were doing a good job versus only 2% who disagreed. It's incredible to think about in 2024. This article shows Bernard DeVoto at his most free-thinking, his most maverick, his most courageous. And when this article came out, J. Edgar Hoover was furious. He put Bernard DeVoto on the FBI's blacklist, and Joe McCarthy started to try to ban Bernard DeVoto books. J. Edgar Hoover sent out a warning about Bernard DeVoto to every FBI headquarters in all 48 states and 3 territories. And J. Edgar Hoover launched an intense investigation into a question that was really bugging him. He wanted to know if Bernard DeVoto had learned about a specific investigation about a specific person and had thereby learned actual investigatory techniques that the FBI was using. J. Edgar Hoover failed for a pretty stupid reason. I won't give any spoilers. It's in my book. And at the risk of sounding self-aggrandizing, I can tell you that I found what the FBI did not. And the answer is deep inside of Bernard DeVoto's archive at Stanford University. And when I first started looking into this, whether I could find the answer to this question that the FBI could not, I thought that if I was able to, that it would turn out to be one of the DeVoto's neighbors in Cambridge, probably a Harvard professor. So I was shocked when it turned out to be a guy who lived in my hometown, Missoula, Montana. His name is Roald Peterson. And the story of what happened to him, I learned because I was able to find one of his granddaughters who's still alive. And she shared with me 70-year-old oral history from her late mother. But through the Montana Historical Society, the Missoula County Courthouse, and in FBI files, I was able to find contemporary documentation that backed up this entire ridiculous, Baroque, and tragic story that Rold's granddaughter told me. What happened to Rold was this. In 1949, two anonymous FBI informants accused him of having once been a communist. They were wrong. At best, they were mistaken. At worst, they were malicious. Because Rold Peterson was accused, he had to undergo a loyalty investigation. If you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, you know what loyalty investigations were like. While Rold was being investigated, Montanans of every political stripe, by the dozen, spoke out in his defense. But the going through this loyalty investigation ordeal, it was really hell on Rold's family. He had three children with a woman that he married, and she was from the New Orleans area. And while Rold's loyalty was being investigated, his wife suffered a psychotic break, and her sister had her committed to what was then unfortunately known as the East Louisiana Asylum for the Insane. And while she was on her way there, she talked to a man in New Orleans who decided to also inform to the FBI on Rold Peterson based on his understanding of a conversation that he had with a soon-to-be ex-spouse who was on her way to a literal insane asylum. This is a source that J. Edgar Hoover found credulous. That source told the FBI that it sounded to him like Rold Peterson was, quote, behaving like a homosexual, unquote. This is in Rold Peterson's FBI file. This came at a time, mind you, when Joe McCarthy was going across America saying he was out to expose all, quote, communists and queers, unquote, which was high irony, because working for Joe McCarthy at the time, as he had just worked for Pat McCarran, was the infamous attorney Roy Cohn, a closeted gay man who at that time was in love with the gentleman sitting on the other side of Joe McCarthy, G. David Schein. But for Americans not as politically connected as Roy Cohn, the results could be tragic. Based on that new false allegation, Rold Peterson was investigated again, and this time he was fired from the U.S. Forest Service. And because of that, he lost his family's ranch in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. If you've ever seen the TV show Yellowstone, the place where they film the property that they have cast as the Dutton family ranch, that is in Montana's Bitterroot Valley. Rold lived not too far away from there. That's an example of what was taken from him. A Montana judge deciding custody of the three kids between an institutionalized mom and an accused dad put the kids into foster care, and they were abused. And the two youngest kids eventually committed suicide. This is the human cost of McCarthyism. And something not dissimilar happened to a higher profile conservation ally of Bernard DeVoto's. This is Wyoming Senator Lester Hunt. Senator Hunt's son was arrested in Washington, D.C. under suspicion of being gay. And when that happened, two of McCarran and McCarthy's Senate allies blackmailed Senator Hunt and told him that if he did not resign, Joe McCarthy was going to go to Wyoming and make a campaign issue out of his son's arrest. You'll have to read my book to see what happened to poor Senator Hunt. We have all seen some of Senator Hunt's legacy. He was the guy who chose this to be the emblem of the state of Wyoming, the buckaroo on the Bronco. What Bernard DeVoto could see was that a pattern had emerged. People who stood between Pat McCarran and his designs to loot natural resources on public lands, those people found themselves investigated, harassed, smeared, persecuted. And come the 1950s, Pat McCarran had a new way to literally funnel resources from public lands to his cronies. Dams. Multi-million dollar dams. Dams are an incredibly complicated conservation issue. They make life possible for tens of millions of people in the West. They waste an enormous amount of water. But come the 1950s, whatever remained of a natural balance in the West was at risk of being permanently overturned because so many dams had already been been built, that some of the only places left where dams could be built were inside national parks and monuments, because in order to build a dam, you have to have certain physical parameters. You have to have a canyon. So once again, Pat McCarran used his dark magic on Senate appropriations committees. He withheld money from the National Park Service so that it could not defend itself, and he poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the two big dam building agencies, the Bureau of Reclamation and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And so, empowered by Pat McCarran, those agencies drew up plans to build dams either inside of or close enough to flood out significant portions of national park units, including the Grand Canyon in Arizona and Yellowstone in Wyoming and Glacier National Park in Montana and Kings Canyon National Park in California and Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. This wasn't just a Western issue. Fort Donelson National Battlefield in Tennessee. But the very first guillotine blade to fall, the first domino to drop, was going to be a dam built here in the middle of Dinosaur National Monument, which straddles the border of Colorado and DeVoto's home state of Utah. If a dam could be built here, it would give a green light to all those other dams to move forward. And if America could not protect its national parks, its best known and most beloved public lands, no other acre of public land stood a chance against eventually becoming exploited and liquidated. And Bernard DeVoto knew what he had to do. He had done it before. He would write another blockbuster magazine article, but he wanted this article to reach even more people than Harper's Magazine could, so he placed it in the biggest and best read magazine of his era, the Saturday Evening Post, and he gave it another attention-grabbing headline like the West against itself. This one is called, "Shall We Let Them Ruin Our National Parks?" This article by Bernard DeVoto let the American people know the threat that dams posed to national parks and public lands. That's Dinosaur National Monument in the background. And what happened when Bernard DeVoto let the American people know about yet more malfeasance that ultimately Nevada Senator Pat McCarran was behind? Well, it got Bernard DeVoto attacked coast to coast by McCarran's understudy, Joe McCarthy. This is a scoop. In the lead up to the 1952 election, the person who Joe McCarthy attacked most conspicuously often and most viciously was public lands journalist Bernard DeVoto. But while this is Joe McCarthy that we're talking about, not exactly a stickler for facts and accuracy, when McCarthy went on nationwide radio to attack Bernard DeVoto, he called him, this is the audio portion of the presentation, we'll see if this works. Richard DeVoto. It did work. In case you couldn't make that out, that is Joe McCarthy on nationwide radio calling Bernard DeVoto Richard DeVoto. But unfortunately, Joe McCarthy was not done. He started to attack magazines that published Bernard DeVoto's conservation articles, and Bernard DeVoto began to get blacklisted from the Saturday Evening Post and Reader's Digest and Fortune magazine. This was a crisis for conservation because Bernard DeVoto was the most important spokesperson for public lands conservation in his era. This was also a crisis for the DeVoto family because if he couldn't get published, they couldn't keep a roof over their head. This was their livelihood. Fortunately, Bernard had Avis, and Avis had Bernard, and they began to collaborate together more closely than ever before, brainstorming new and alternative stories that Bernard could pitch and write, sometime under a pseudonym. He did a lot of work for Women's Day magazine in this era. Different types of stories that he could do to compensate for his getting blacklisted. Avis suggested that he write about kitchen knives, because remember, ever since Avis was a little girl in Houghton, Michigan, she was fascinated with food and with cooking. And Bernard DeVoto did that under his own name in Harper's Magazine, and in early 1952, that got him a fan letter from a new friend and ally, Julia Child. One of the things that Avis did for Bernard was she answered a lot of his fan mail. So Avis wrote Julia back, Julia wrote Avis back, and they had such chemistry that they became best friends for the rest of their lives. And Julia confided something in her new best friend slash pen pal, Avis DeVoto. Julia told Avis that she had a dream of writing an encyclopedic cookbook of French recipes. And Avis, who, remember, ever since she was a little girl in Houghton, Michigan, was fascinated with food and with cooking. She was so excited and inspired by this idea from this then unknown aspiring author named Julia Child that Avis made a promise. She promised to use Bernard DeVoto's contacts in the publishing industry to get Julia Child a breakout book deal. This is a photo of Avis and Julia together. This friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs, particularly between Avis and Julia, it's very famous. It's been in documentaries, it's been in books, it's been in in a hit movie. What people don't understand about this incredible friendship is that it came together because of the DeVotos' McCarthy-era fight to save our national parks and public lands. And because we're sort of in a little bit of a show and tell format, I was hoping I could beg your indulgence to give you a taste, if you'll pardon the pun, of a little bit of the depth and emotion that was part of this extraordinary friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs. The Childs added the DeVotos to a select group of dear friends to whom they would always send handmade valentines. Paul Child was a very talented artist, and some of these handmade valentines that he would make could be whimsical, like this kind of funny Victorian-looking scene. Sometimes the valentines could be risque. Here are Paul and Julia in the bathtub together. Sometimes they could be very ornate. This Valentine that Paul hand painted looks like it could be a stained glass window. Sometimes Paul's composition could be risque. This was a photo that Julia took of him painting en plein air, shall we say. This is a poem that Paul wrote on the back of that last Valentine, and you'll notice that the first letter of each line spells from top to bottom to Avis and Bernard. This is a photograph of Julia Child's kitchen in France in 1953, up on the shelf where you might expect to find a cookbook. Instead, you find The Course of Empire by Bernard DeVoto. This is a collection of cards of organizations that Bernard DeVoto belonged to. There's his National Parks Lifetime Pass, his Sierra Club Pass, his Outdoor Writers Association of America membership card. And up in the top corner, there is his official honorary membership in the L'École des Trois Gourmands, the cooking school that Julia taught in France. Like I said, this friendship between the DeVotos and the Childs, it's very famous. What people don't understand about it is that it came together because of the DeVotos' McCarthy-era fight to save our national parks and public lands. And the Childs weren't the only new friend and ally to come into the DeVotos' lives because of their crusade. I'm going to let this logger in Montana's Bitterroot Mountains introduce the next one. He says, "I'll be goddamned, I never thought I'd meet Adlai Stevenson here." Adlai Stevenson was the Democratic nominee for president in 1952 and 1956, and in 54, he asked DeVoto to give him a field lesson in conservation. And so they met secretly in Missoula, Montana, and DeVoto took Stevenson up into the Bitterroot Mountains and taught him about chain smoking. I'm joking. He taught him about his passion, rangeland health, grass holds the soil. Friends, this is grassroots politics. And Stevenson begins to get the DeVoto public lands philosophy. Somebody has left a sloppy campsite and he yells out, "Clean it up, you son of a bitch." But the number one thing that DeVoto impresses on Stevenson is that the reason for public lands conservation is to protect the sources of clean, cold water, which is the lifeblood of the West, in which Stevenson attempts to catch a cutthroat trout on a fly in. If Adlai Stevenson is elected president, Bernard DeVoto is probably going to be either his Secretary of Agriculture or Secretary of the Interior. But DeVoto is thinking ahead just in case Stevenson is not the guy to get his public lands conservation ideas into the White House. DeVoto is also keeping up a robust conservation correspondence with his senator in Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy. But that's all in the future. Come 1955, the crisis for conservation in America was this river, the Green River, and whether a dam was going to be built across it inside Dinosaur National Monument, taking a landscape that looks about like this and making it look about like this. And the American people don't want this. Letters to members of Congress about this proposed dam are 80-1 against it. But the dam still has all the momentum it needs to get built because nobody machinates minority power in government better than Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, who is simultaneously marshaling all the cultural power of McCarthyism. People who oppose this dam, they get called weak and disloyal, communist and gay. While the U.S. Congress was debating these dams, Paul Child got subjected to a loyalty investigation. Paul Child was accused of being gay, despite all the documentary evidence he could provide to the contrary. Avis DeVoto, for the rest of her life, would always think that Paul Child being investigated in that way at that time was retribution for the Childs being conservation allies of the DeVotos. And all of this took a heavy psychic toll on Bernard DeVoto. All this worry for his country, meaning the public lands of the West, all this worry for his country, meaning the United States of America. DeVoto asked, if our wilderness was destroyed, how in 100 years would anyone know what wonders there were in this America of ours? In late 1955, Bernard DeVoto got another one of these opportunities that he always tried to seize, a chance to address a mass audience of Americans about conservation. He was asked to go to New York City and be on a CBS TV show and tell the story of Mesa Verde National Park. Mesa Verde in southwest Colorado is a homeland of the ancestral Puebloan people. The ancestral Puebloans lived in the American West for centuries. They irrigated farmland, they built towns and cities. The ancestral Puebloans built the tallest skyscrapers in North America until Chicago in the 1880s. And tree rings tell the story that around the year 1200, centuries before Columbus, the climate warmed a little bit and megadroughts struck. And the ancestral Puebloans abandoned their farms and towns and cities, and they vanished. And Bernard DeVoto thought that a parable about a civilization in the American West that vanished when they didn't practice water conservation, that would shift public opinion about dam building toward caution and conservation and preservation. And DeVoto put everything that he had into that broadcast, all his growing up in the West and reading about the West and writing about the West and traveling around the West and talking to Westerners and bringing new conservation allies into the West, including this gentleman in the white hat right there. That is book publisher Alfred Knopf. Remember him? DeVoto infused the broadcast with the spirit of all the cigarettes he smoked in the West, all the good times he had with his friends in the U.S. Forest Service. Friends, despite my aversion to spoilers, I have to apologize here because I don't know a way around having to reveal right here that Bernard DeVoto does not make it. He dies right after that broadcast, November 13th, 1955. But had DeVoto lived until the end of that month, he would have seen headlines like this across America: a victory for Bernard DeVoto. Because of that conservation coalition that he built and led, he convinced the Eisenhower administration to reverse itself and to not build a dam inside Dinosaur National Monument. This upheld the sanctity of the U.S. Park Service. It also upheld the precedent of not exploiting and liquidating every acre of federally protected lands, public and tribal. The credit should certainly go to Bernard DeVoto, but it should equally go to Avis DeVoto, because without Avis, there never would have been Bernard. And when Bernard died at the age of 58, Avis was only 51, and she was devastated because not only had she lost her romantic partner of 33 years, she also lost her professional partner. The professional skills that Avis lent to Bernard DeVoto included editing and idea generating and proofreading and fan mail answering. Fortunately, when Avis was at her absolute lowest, she had one of history's great best friends. When Julia Child found out, she rushed a plane ticket to Avis and brought her to Europe. And Julia spent weeks cooking for Avis and caring for Avis and nurturing Avis. And Julia set Avis's heart on the slow path toward healing. And eventually, Avis had a realization. She realized that though she never again would have a romantic partner, she could have another professional partner. And so Avis transferred to Julia Child all the professional skills that she had lent to Bernard DeVoto, editing and idea generating and copy editing. Avis DeVoto was the only person who Julia Child deputized to answer her fan mail. And Avis kept that promise that she made to Julia Child when they first met. It took her 10 hard years, but Avis did use Bernard's contacts in the publishing industry to get Julia Child her breakout book deals. Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volumes 1 and 2 were published by Alfred Knopf. Through this presentation, I've been able to show you a little bit of film of Bernard DeVoto from a home movie that I discovered that had been moldering in an archive for decades. I never was able to find any footage of Avis DeVoto. So the closest I can come to showing you what animate Avis was like comes, courtesy of fair use laws, from the silver screen. This is Deborah Rush opposite Meryl Streep as Julia Child in the hit 2009 movie Julie and Julia. Another representation of Avis DeVoto on film comes from the HBO Max series Julia, which starred Bebe Neuwirth as Avis DeVoto. This is one of the great friendships in American history. This is a friendship that came together because of the DeVoto's McCarthy-era fight to save our national parks and public lands. When Avis grew elderly, she joined with other women in her adopted hometown of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they got this built. This is JFK Memorial Park. For her efforts in 1984, the Cambridge City Council voted unanimously to honor Avis by etching her name into Harvard Square. So today, a ledge at the corner of Brattle and Mount Auburn Streets reads, Bernard and Avis DeVoto, Friends of Cambridge Conservation. Although Bernard had been dead for more than 3 decades, Avis still wanted him beside her. Of course, that's not the only place where the DeVotos are publicly honored. There is also the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove at the top of the Bitterroot Mountains near the border of Idaho and Montana, deep inside the Clearwater National Forest. That grove of ancient red cedar trees was dedicated in September 1962. That's the DeVoto's friend and source in the U.S. Forest Service, Chet Olson, speaking at the dedication ceremony. The person who escorted Avis to the ceremony was Montana Senator Lee Metcalf, born at the base of those mountains. Here they are together on the front of my hometown newspaper, the Missoulian. And at the dedication ceremony, Senator Metcalf read aloud a special message from President Kennedy. And Kennedy began by honoring Avis, and he went on to talk about how he had been inspired by Bernard DeVoto. And Avis would write Kennedy back. Avis would also visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove one more time. When Bernard DeVoto died, Avis arranged for his ashes to be spread over the Clearwater National Forest from a smoke jumper plane. And when Avis died, her son Mark, pictured here with her at the dedication ceremony, he brought her ashes to the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove and scattered them. He spiritually and literally brought his parents, Bernard and Avis DeVoto, back together again. In that September 1962 thank you letter that Avis sent to President Kennedy, she offered him some advice. Because Avis was daring like that, she would offer unsolicited advice to the President of the United States. Avis's advice was that one day he, President Kennedy, should visit the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. She told him that although there were more scenically awesome places in America, she had never before found another place that was simultaneously so peaceful and so majestic. Even though President Kennedy wasn't ever able to take Avis up on her advice, I feel like it's good advice to wind this talk down with. If you are ever fortunate enough to be traveling Highway 12 across the Bitterroot Mountains and you're near the border of Idaho and Montana, you should stop at the DeVoto Memorial Cedar Grove. Because of public lands conservation, you'll find that it's still everything that Avis said it was. And even if you're not able to stop, even if all you can do is take note of the highway sign as you pass by, now you know. There's a pretty interesting story there. So thank you so much, Traverse Library. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this story with you. Thank you so very much.
That was fantastic. I could listen to you all night long. You are such a great speaker.
Oh, well, thank you. It's really really an honor to do this, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share this story. So thank you so much, Betsy.
Oh, you're so welcome. I just gained a lot more insight than I ever thought I would.
That's great.
So
Well, it's also really cool and really an honor to be able to talk about Avis DeVoto to an audience in Michigan. She's one of the great citizens that Michigan has given our country. So it was great to learn about her, and it's great to share her story with you.
yeah, it comes out by the way, well, by your book and also by the way you speak that you
Oh.
definitely researched this very well and know your stuff on it for sure.
It was an adventure. It was really it was a fun project. It was a hard project, but it was wonderful to do, and I'm so glad I did it. So thank you. I'm so glad you listened to it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I also in your book, I being a librarian, I absolutely love your glossary in the back of your book.
Thank you. All
And
right, that's a very librarian compliment, but I take it that means a lot. Thank you.
it does. Your and the note, I love the notes too. Those are fun to go back and go back and forth in the book on. I mean, that's a
I'm
huge section of your book is the
I
notes.
love it I love it that you read those. I was like, is anyone going to care about the notes? If you appreciated them, then they were all worth it. So
Oh
thank
yeah,
you.
absolutely. It was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions at all for Mr. Schweber? I think you're good.
Okay. Well,
I
you know, I
appreciate
have a website, nateschweber.com. If anything occurs to you later, drop me a line anytime. And yeah, I just want to tell you how grateful I am. So thank you so very much, Traverse City Library and Betsy and everybody who checked this out live and everybody who might check it out on the YouTube channel.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much. Have